From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm David Reed. Since the start of its civil war, Syria has been an extremely dangerous place for reporters and photographers to work. The Assad regime has banned foreign journalists, and they face dangers from all sides, including desperate rebels and hostile Islamist militants. Conditions have deteriorated this year and could get even worse. The U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee voted yesterday to authorize President Barack Obama to launch military strikes in Syria because of the regime's apparent use of chemical weapons. The full Senate will consider the resolution next week. Obama joined world leaders in northern Russia today for the Group of 20 talks on international issues. And the debate over military strikes in Syria will overshadow the summit, particularly because Russia is selling weapons to the regime and strongly opposes Western military intervention. Our two-part program will focus on the impact Syria is having on relations with Russia and on a photojournalist who talked about working conditions in Syria and will tell his harrowing story of being abducted by rebels near the capital Damascus and held for ransom. But first, World Watch, a brief summary of international news with Raymond Tungakar.
Thanks, David. Officials in Mexico and Brazil are demanding explanations from the U.S. after documents leaked by Edward Snowden showed the NSA spied on Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian announced the revelations on a Brazilian TV show on Sunday, causing tension between the Latin American countries and the U.S. Some have speculated that the controversy will cause Rousseff to cancel her planned visit to the White House next month, but Brazilian officials have not yet addressed the visit, saying the country's reaction will depend on the U.S.'s explanation. Israel and the United States tested missiles as part of a joint military exercise in the Mediterranean on Tuesday, heightening tensions with Russia and Syria. The launch went unannounced and followed President Obama's announcement the U.S. would use airstrikes on Syria in response to the Syrian regime's alleged use of chemical weapons last month. Russian radar detected two ballistic objects, raising concern the U.S. was attacking Syria. The Prime Minister of Yemen survived an assassination attempt while being driven home from his office. An advisor to Prime Minister Mohammed Salem Sindwa said unidentified gunmen sprayed the three-car motorcade with bullets, but no one was hurt and no group claimed responsibility. Sindwa was chosen to lead a government of national unity in 2011 after the president resigned under pressure. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir and South Sudanese President Salva Kiir met in Khartoum to discuss the future of Sudanese oil exports, which are vital to both economies. Kiir denied that South Sudan has used money from oil exports to support insurgent groups in Sudan, and al-Bashir dropped his threat to shut down oil pipelines. And that's it for World Watch.
Thank you, Raymond.
My pleasure.
1 year ago, Global Journalist interviewed French-American photojournalist Jonathan Alperi as he was about to make his third trip inside Syria. Several months later, he was captured by militants, held for ransom, and was just released in July. He's speaking to us now from New York City. Jonathan, welcome back, and we're all grateful that you're safe and sound.
Thank you for having me.
As we said in our last interview, you've risked your life repeatedly to bring home photographs from nearly a dozen conflict zones, beginning in the South Caucasus as a freelancer in 2004. Why is it so important for journalists to get inside Syria despite the danger?
Well, Syria is a very difficult conflict to cover because of its violence and its, the casualty rates, both military and civilians, are very high. The intensity of the fighting is also very intense. And so for that alone, for Western journalists to go inside, that's a challenge that I think can only be undertaken by people who have plenty of experience. And obviously the conflict in Syria is strategically important due to its geography, situation in the Middle East, but the fact also that this war can spread out to different countries and become a major regional conflict.
And the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders reports that at least 15 foreign journalists are missing or have been abducted or arrested in Syria. And an analyst with his Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Center said that in recent weeks there has been a discernible spike in reported kidnappings in northern Syria. But Jonathan, there's a lot of them that don't go reported. So what's your sense of how many abductions and arrests have actually happened there in Syria?
Well, officially it's between 12 to 15. I know for a fact through various sources that I can't mention in this interview, but there are more. Some just happened very recently, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's becoming more and more common for different reasons as the rebellion is becoming a more and more Islamist type fighting force. So these elements are more than happy to kidnap Western journalists for money or because they're Westerners or because they realize that the Western press is not going to help them in any way anymore.
And the regime's soldiers also have motivations for stopping journalists from reporting inside the country also. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's true. And we know also that a couple of these guys that have been missing for a while are in Syrian jails inside Damascus and we don't have any news. But I think the government has made a very big mistake to, behaving like that towards us, especially because they didn't let us cover their side nearly as much as the rebellion has in the past. And overall, I think it's been a mistake. But because the government has been doing a lot of massive killings, obviously they're trying to hide that.
And I was listening to a report from the editor of a news service who was saying that his reporters are facing or encountering more Islamic militants in Syria. Apparently their territories has spread in Syria. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I would add further to this with the notion that if you look at the first generation of fighters, rebel fighters who picked up arms 2.5 years ago to defeat the regime, I would say over 90%, 95%, even maybe close to 100% of them were moderate Muslims. So you have doctors, lawyers, local peasants who picked up arms and started fighting. Now, a lot of these guys are dead now. Casualties are very high within the rebellion, probably close to between 30 or 40,000 killed, from my sources. So a lot of these, first generation moderate Muslims, a lot of them have been replaced by more hardcore Muslims, Islamists, and foreign fighters inside the country.
All right. And let's talk about your experiences on this last trip into the country. How was this different from your previous attempts to get inside the country?
Well, usually you come in from Turkey, so very different environment, different people. Syria is a very diverse nation ethnically, and obviously when you start working close to Damascus, where I was going through Lebanon, that's very dangerous. Hezbollah is there. The border is much more controlled. The government is far more present because it's a very strategic area for them, and they need it far more than they need the northern part of their country.
And once you got inside, where did you go? What kind of subjects did you photograph?
Well, when I got in, I was shooting in a town called Yabrut, which is kind of a big town in the area that's more or less controlled by the rebellion. When I got in, things got worse quickly because the shelling got more and more intense, and so the government, was more and more proactive in, putting pressure on the rebels in the area. And then when I was captured, Qusair fell, and then Homs, and then Hezbollah got close to our positions, and we were being attacked on a daily basis. A lot of artillery fire, MiGs, helicopters. So every day, the military situation got more and more intense for me and the guys with me.
Okay, and what happened to you? What were you doing when you were abducted?
I mean, the first month, actually more, the first 5.5 weeks, I was handcuffed, tied to a bed. The first about week, I was blindfolded, and they removed that. And after the first 3 weeks, I was in one house, and that was pretty tough. They did mock executions.
When you say mock executions, what do you mean?
Like, once with pistol, one with a machine gun on my forehead, and once they came in with knives, pretended to cut my throat, stuff like that, accusing me of being a spy, a CIA agent, FBI, and so forth.
And they're trying to break you, get information out of you?
Yeah, they were trying to do that. They were trying to. I think they were also trying to force me to admit to things that I wasn't, that I wasn't. But I never broke. I never agreed to any of it. So.
And can you describe who these men were?
So it seems that there are local katiba, which is a tactical unit, which varies from 10 guys to a few thousand. So it's great tactical differences. This local katiba is probably the most powerful in that area where I was, and they control different villages, mountains, and stuff like that near Damascus. And they're the ones who caught me, and kept me for 3 months.
And did you develop any good relations with them over time?
I did, and the reason why it worked out is because what I did is I tried to integrate as much as I could to their life. So I would pray with them. They even asked me if I want to convert, but I would always never really answer the question. So I never did, and I never would. And I would count ammunition with them. I would cook with them. So I really tried to be, with them. I'd let my beard grow and try to be as much as they are by learning the language as well and stuff like that. That they really appreciate it. So it made things simpler for me.
And when did you get a sense that you may be getting out?
I had no idea until it actually happened.
What happened? The day that you were released?
I can't tell you all the details for various reasons, but I was released by somebody who is close to the Bashar al-Assad regime, and apparently he paid my ransom, and he negotiated with various groups, and they agreed to take the money. And that tells you a lot about the kind of rebels that these people are, because they are Islamists and they are fighting against the regime, but they were also willing to take a lot of money for me to supply them with extra ammunition, weapons to keep on fighting. So it's a very gray area. It's not black and white.
Do they? There are a lot of reports that the rebels are actually losing this war. What was their attitude toward the possibility of winning or losing?
Well, I do agree. First of all, they are losing this war. I think it's not reversible now. I don't even think if the West intervenes in some sort of way, it's going to change anything. So the rebels have lost a lot of strategic areas, and they'll never get it back. They don't have the hardware to do so. But at the end of the day, I really wonder if it's really what we want. If we want Bashar al-Assad to go, or we want something else that's truly an unknown.
And speaking of intervention, did the rebels you were encountering both before and after your capture talk about the use of chemical weapons?
Yes. From the first time it happened, they became public recently, and then François Hollande, and then Cameron and Barack Obama, everybody was very active publicly to say how wrong it was. It is wrong, obviously, but with that being said, I do not believe the Bashar al-Assad government did it. I am pretty convinced from my experience on the ground and sources and and different things, that the Islamist portions of the rebellions are probably the ones who did it, not the Bashar al-Assad government.
Okay. I know you can't say all of the evidence, but what's an example of an indication that you think that the rebels might be behind this?
Well, for one thing, tactically, it really makes no sense for Bashar al-Assad to use these chemical weapons, because he's winning this conflict and he knows the consequences of using them. So he can still win by using conventional weapons. So using them makes no sense whatsoever. To me, that's the main argument. And number two, there are reports now that are coming out that Saudi Arabia might have supplied the rebels with chemical weapons. And, once it's in Syria, it's hard to control. You don't know who has them. And we also know for a fact that Islamist portions of the rebellions have captured in the past stocks of chemical weapons. And these guys will not hesitate to use them and blame it on the government so they can get help from the West.
Okay. And now if the U.S. does lead a military strike against the Assad region, are you concerned that the Islamists could fill a power vacuum?
Yeah, because when it comes to fighting, these guys are the most hardcore, they're the best fighters, they're willing to die for their cause, and so on and so forth. So if Bashar al-Assad goes, and therefore the Alawite power inside Syria, the ones who really, the more hardcore, more intense ones will be in charge, and that means Islamists. Yeah.
Okay. And would you go back to Syria and work again?
No, yeah, no, I think that's it for me. And I was told not to by various people because I know now that I was captured, money was paid, so I'm assuming other people would try to capture me again. So.
And are you keeping in touch with some of the other journalists who are going in and out?
Yes, I know a bunch of, we all know each other, most of us. There's not that many of us to begin with. And, but yeah, most people now do think twice about going again over and over, considering that the kidnappings have become such an important aspect of our work. And, as a journalist, you can't spend your entire day hiding and not doing your work, so it's not worth it.
Okay. Where would you like to go next?
I was thinking of Egypt. I'm waiting to see right now, but we'll wait. So for now, I'm in New York working.
I wanted to just backtrack and fill in a gap in our conversation. And could you describe how you were captured?
Yeah, towards the end of my trip, I convinced my fixer to bring me to the south of the front line, about 30 kilometers north of Damascus, to do work with a local unit, rebel unit. Mm-hmm. And he got in on the deal with another fixer that I didn't know, who I think is the guy who sold me to these units, by telling him in advance there's a Western journalist photographer coming in. So we got a car, we went to meet them, and they had a checkpoint waiting for me. The guys were wearing ski masks and machine guns. They dragged me out of the car, they took all my gear, put me on my knees, pretended to execute me with a pistol, then blindfolded me, handcuffed me, put me in a car, and then that's how it all began for me.
You've been reunited with your family. Tell us what that was like.
Well, I was in Beirut for a while because at the French embassy, because I had no documents, so the French government helped me out to leave the country because I really wasn't welcome in Lebanon anymore for various reasons. And so I went back to Paris for a week, and I've met my family in New York when I came back, and they met me at the airport.
Okay, that's great. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, and we all wish you luck in your next foray into a war zone and appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you.
Before we continue our discussion, I want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcasts at globaljournalist.org. You can also find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. Please send us questions or comments via globaljournalist@kbia.org or our Facebook page. You could also follow us on Twitter at globaljourn. And now to discuss the international implications of Western intervention in Syria, I'm joined by Nicholas Gvozdov. He's a senior editor at the National Interest and a professor of national security issues at the U.S. Naval War College. Also with us is Ronald Sunni. He's a professor of political and social history at the University of Michigan. How does President Vladimir Putin portray the two-year-old conflict in Syria and the possible military strike by the United States? Nick, if we could start with you.
Certainly. Let me give you my own opinion on that. My sense is that Putin and the Russian government have always viewed this as a civil war. They do not see it as a humanitarian crisis. They don't see why the responsibility to protect should ever have been invoked. They simply see it as one group rebelling against the state and really over the last year losing on the battlefield, and therefore there's no reason for intervention. When it comes to the use of chemical weapons, particularly the most recent incident, the Russians are very skeptical of the evidence that has been presented publicly so far. They've always maintained that chemical weapons use, if it occurs in Syria, could just as easily be attributed to the opposition as to the government. And therefore, they have insisted on an extremely high bar of evidence to be presented to them and to the international community to convince them that the Assad government indeed is responsible. Barring that type of evidence, the Russians have said that they will block action in the Security Council to take a military strike against Syria unless they can be convinced that Assad is responsible.
And Ron, do you have can you add to that?
Yeah, everything Nick says sounds exactly right to me. I would add, in the context, the larger context, it seems to me, is that there's a kind of struggle, a kind of proxy war going on. Mm-hmm. Luckily, at the moment, it's a war of words and not of action between Russia and the United States and much of Europe. And there are several aspects to this. First of all, for Russia, Syria is like their lone friend in that part of the world. They have a base there. They've forgiven Syria's debt some years ago. They trade with Syria, not significantly, but they consider Assad a kind of friend. And one of the few places, if not a foothold, a toehold.
And they sell a lot of military arms there as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So all of that shows that they're on a different side than the United States.
Right.
The other part of the context that I would mention is that the United States is seen by Russia as a state that is willing to take kind of precipitate action far from home for all kinds of reasons. And it has a kind of self-initiated, self-recognized international role to play. And Russia, of course, doesn't like that. Russia's relatively weak at the moment. It's not particularly hegemonic, maybe except in places like the Caucasus. So it doesn't have real clout in the world. And Russia wants definitely for the United States and Europe to go through the UN, to set up rules of the game that include the UN. That's their definition of the international community, not friends in the neighborhood and not NATO alone. So there's a lot of issues going on here. Russia sees this as a very important point of dispute between the United States and itself.
Nick, so what does Russia have in stake in preventing this foreign intervention in Syria?
Russia was willing to essentially let Gaddafi go in 2011 because Gaddafi was erratic. He was not really seen as a partner of Russia. So that when the Russians allowed the no-fly zone to pass the United Nations by abstaining from that resolution, they weren't too worried about the impact. Assad is different, and Ron has already laid out that Assad is seen as a friend, he's seen as a partner. The Russians know that it's not just Assad, but other countries that see themselves as friends and partners of Russia need to be reassured that Russia is prepared to defend them, perhaps not to the level that they might like. The Russians certainly aren't going to intervene militarily to stop the United States from undertaking a strike. But everything short of a military response, Russia believes that it's important to show that it will stand by its partners, because behind Syria, certainly Iran is looking at Russia's reaction. You have some of the states of Central Asia, the Venezuelans who have moved closer to the Russians in recent years. They're all looking to see the extent to which Moscow is prepared to defy the United States, to stand by those countries which it sees as its international partners.
And Ron, if we can expand on that, what Nick was saying about possible responses from Russia, what are some of the more subtle responses that might take place if we do go ahead with a military strike in Syria?
Syria is certainly a problem for Russia, but Putin is a real pragmatist. He's practical. He's a kind of realist. As Nick said, he's not sentimental about humanitarian questions. Atrocities are unfortunate, but this is not something that he's going to involve Russia to try to remedy. So if you think of him in that sort of realistic way, America is far more important. His relationship with Obama is far more important. Things keep getting in the way, though. Snowden, or human rights in Russia, or Pussy Riot, or now Syria. So we do have real differences with Russia, but Putin, I think, is a person who would like to find a modus vivendi with the United States, and Syria is one of the key obstacles here. Like Snowden, he might wish it would go away. It's not going away. So his response is going to be, I think, relatively low-key. If it can be turned over to the UN, and he even hinted today that he would like to see it in the UN and that he may not stand in the way of a response by the UN if it can be proven that the chemical weapons were definitely launched by the Assad regime. So he's looking for a way to get out from under, I think, this. I don't see, and I'd love Nick to if Nick disagrees here or agrees, I don't think he wants to use this for any kind of advantage. Right now he's got the conference in St. Petersburg, he's got bigger fish to fry, and there are a lot of small things getting in the way of him playing a kind of statesman-like role.
Well, Nick, he may beef up military aid, right? And maybe possibly use this as leverage in Iran and Egypt?
It's a possibility. I mean, he could certainly begin to increase weapons deliveries to Syria. The Russians could reconsider their self-imposed embargo of certain weapons components to Iran, which the UN sanctions were grandfathered in by the latest round of UN sanctions, but with the Russians voluntarily chose not to deliver. They could give some intelligence assistance to Syria to help them with air defense. We could also see where the Russians might, and I think Ron is right here, the Russians don't want to interrupt completely a relationship with the United States, but they might show their irritation in a few areas. They could, just as the Pakistanis have done, they could interrupt the supply lines into Afghanistan for a short period to register their discontent. They might hold up some intelligence sharing on terrorism issues. But in part, that might be linked to also, and this might be a point of disagreement then with Ron, is I think it's true that the Russians do want to have a modus vivendi with the United States, but increasingly they think that the United States believes it doesn't need Russia, so that perhaps showing where Washington does need Russia by withholding help down the line might be a way to do that. With the G20, certainly the narrative of the G20 has changed, because 2 weeks ago it was going to be about how world leaders were going to be, or at least certainly President Obama would be rebuking President Putin for human rights issues and other such things. What we've seen, very interestingly, the announcement of the bilateral sits that Putin is going to have in St. Petersburg. He's going to have a bilateral sit-down with President Xi Jinping of China, President Park of South Korea, with Japanese Prime Minister Abe. He's definitely signaling at the G20 that he is looking eastward towards Asia, and that if the United States and Europe want to not necessarily play ball with Russia and they want to raise the Syria issue, that he's looking for new options, and some of those options lie in the east rather than the west.
Okay, and Ron, finally, briefly, could you give us your opinion on what's going to happen in St. Petersburg at the G20 summit? Will there be icy relations with Russian and U.S. Dignitaries, or do you think that there possibly will be some words, some conflict there?
I'm not an expert in body language, but apparently people take very seriously the way Putin looks, the way he slouches, and so forth. And this has caused some difficulty with the United States. I mean, he's a kind of dour type, right? But he's actually a very intelligent type. And even though I think he's probably getting a little bit tired now, you know, he's been in power a long time and maybe running out of steam to a certain degree, I think he would like this to be a kind of place for him to show the world that Russia is still important, that we are a player, despite the fact that they're militarily weak and have other kinds of internal problems, etc. I don't think he's in a great position to do that, because there's so many problems on the table for him to deal with. Hopefully, he and Obama will find a way, an image, a photo op, something that will at least allow for further steps in warmer relations.
Okay.
Right now, we've gone nowhere with Russia.
Great. Well, thank you, Ron and Nick. It's been a very good conversation, and I appreciate your insight on this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Please join us again next week for another Global Journalist. I'm David Reed.